For more than half a century, the story of the Beatles' breakup has been told as a clash of two titans, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Their rivalry was the stuff of legend, a battle of creative equals and philosophical opposites fighting for the soul of the world's biggest band. Their fights were epic, their post-breakup insults were public and brutal, and their story has been told so many times it feels like gospel. What if the most profound, personal, and damaging feud inside the Beatles wasn't the explosive war between John and Paul? What if the real conflict was a quiet, slow-burning fire of resentment, a war of attrition waged for years in the shadows? It simmered for a decade between George Harrison and the one man he felt consistently and painfully dismissed, his genius. This is the story of not John Lennon, but the man George Harrison truly came to resent, Paul McCartney. To really get the Harrison-McCartney rift, you first have to understand the myth it's always been hidden behind, the Lennon-McCartney feud. And let's be clear, that conflict was massive. John and Paul were the creative engine of the Beatles, a partnership so close they wrote eyeball to eyeball. But that closeness bred a fierce, sibling-like rivalry that could turn toxic. We all know the stories. We've heard about the agonizing sessions for Paul's Oblad Di Oblad Da, which drove John so crazy he stormed out, only to come back hours later, stoned, and hammer out the piano intro in a fit of pure aggression. We know that during the fractured White Album sessions, the band was hardly ever in the same room, each one acting more like a session player for the other's solo tracks. The old gang was fracturing under the weight of their own fame and diverging lives, and when the band finally shattered, the fight went public. Paul dropped his first solo album, McCartney, with a self-interview that basically announced the band's end, a move John saw as a manipulative PR stunt. John's revenge was vicious. On his album, Imagine, he unleashed How Do You Sleep, a song of pure distilled venom aimed right at his old friend, with lyrics like, "The only thing you done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day," and the gut punch, "Those freaks was right when they said you was dead." John weaponized his talent to publicly humiliate Paul. Paul later admitted it was a hurtful attack from a man he still loved. This was a war fought in headlines, and on hit records, a public spectacle. It was loud, angry, and impossible to miss. And because of that, it drowned out the quieter corrosion happening elsewhere in the band. But the very public, explosive nature of the John and Paul fight is exactly why it wasn't the most defining internal struggle. Theirs was a battle of equals. They were the two frontmen, the primary songwriters, the leaders. They gave as good as they got. Their conflict was a hot war, with fiery battles followed by uneasy truces and a longing for reconciliation. The real simmering feud, the one that left the deepest scars and was rooted in a fundamental power imbalance, was between George Harrison and Paul McCartney. This wasn't a battle of equals. From the get-go, it was a relationship defined by seniority and a perceived hierarchy. It wasn't about big, explosive arguments, but a long pile-up of little slights, dismissals, and patronizing comments that slowly wore George down. While John and Paul fought over the steering wheel, George was the one who felt like he was perpetually stuck in the back seat, with Paul constantly reaching back to tell him how to drive. This slow-burn resentment would fester for years, defining George's experience in the band and fueling his own dramatic exit. To find the seed of this conflict, you have to go all the way back, before the screaming fans and the gold records. You have to go back to a school bus in Liverpool. Paul McCartney, a student at the Liverpool Institute, rode the same bus as a younger kid, George Harrison. Paul was older by about 8 months, which at that age can feel like a lifetime. They bonded over a shared obsession, the guitar. It was Paul who, in 1958, suggested George to a skeptical John Lennon for their band, the Quarrymen. George, just 15, had to audition for John on the top deck of a bus, nailing the tricky instrumental Raunchy to prove he had the chops. From that moment, the dynamic was set. Paul was the one who got George in. He was the senior member. George was the talented kid brother. This little brother syndrome was baked into the band's DNA. In the grueling formative years playing for hours in the filth of Hamburg, the roles were cemented. John and Paul were the frontmen, the leaders, the budding songwriting gods. George was the lead guitarist. His job was to cook up the solos and fills that would complete the Lennon-McCartney vision. But it was always about completing their vision. Even in the early days, Paul's musical confidence meant he often took an instructional role. As a multi-instrumentalist who thought like an arranger, Paul had very specific ideas about what George should play. This wasn't always malicious. It was Paul's intense drive to make the song sound exactly like the version in his head. But for a young guitarist trying to find his own style, being constantly directed is stifling. The message, intended or not, was clear. Your job is to support our songs. Patty Boyd, George's first wife, saw this dynamic up close. She said that early hierarchy never really went away. Like a little brother, he was pushed into the background, she recalled. This feeling of being secondary, of being the kid who was talented but shouldn't get too many of his own ideas, created a wound that never truly healed. And as George's own genius began to bloom, Paul's tendency to patronize and control would just keep pouring salt in it. As the Beatles evolved from a pop group into world-changing artists, one thing stayed the same: the Lennon-McCartney songwriting machine. By contract and by habit, they were the creative core. This meant on any given Beatles album, there was barely any room for anyone else. George was typically allowed 1 or 2 songs per record, a quota that got more and more insulting as his own songwriting exploded. He had to fight for scraps from the creative table. As he later put it, he had so many songs stockpiled that he would have needed to release 100 Beatles albums just to get them all out. This wasn't just about a lack of space. It was about a lack of respect. This dismissal led to some of the most infamous stories of the Beatles' studio life. Case study number 1, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Today, it's seen as one of the band's absolute masterpieces. But when George first brought it in during the White Album sessions, the reaction was lukewarm at best. According to George, the others just didn't take it seriously. They were dismissive, and the song was going nowhere. Frustrated, George drove home and called his friend Eric Clapton. He asked Clapton to come play on the track. Clapton was hesitant, saying, "Oh no, I can't do that. Nobody ever plays on Beatles records." George simply told him, "Look, it's my song, and I want you to play on it." When George walked back into the studio with Eric Clapton, the whole mood changed. Suddenly, John and Paul were on their best behavior, taking the song seriously and putting their all into it. Clapton laid down that iconic weeping solo, and the track became a masterpiece. But for George, it was a bitter victory. He had to bring in an outside superstar just to get his own bandmates to respect his work. Case study number 2 is even more blatant: the Hey Jude sessions. Paul wrote the ballad for John's son, Julian. It was his baby. As they worked on the arrangement, George started doing what a lead guitarist does. He tried to find a part. He came up with an idea to play a guitar lick that answered each of Paul's vocal lines. According to George, Paul shot it down, coldly and immediately. Just a simple, "No, you don't." No discussion. For Paul, he was protecting his song's simplicity. For George, it was a humiliating reminder of his place in the pecking order. Even when George wrote a song so brilliant it couldn't be denied, like Something, which Frank Sinatra called the greatest love song of the past 50 years, it was a struggle. Paul himself later admitted they'd overlooked it. In a taped 1969 conversation, Paul told John, "Until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." George's response showed years of frustration. "That's a myth, because most of the songs this year I wrote last year or the year before anyway." He'd been sitting on these gems, just waiting for his bandmates to listen. This constant fight created a deep well of bitterness. George later laid out the dynamic in painfully clear terms. It was always difficult to get a look in because Paul was so pushy. He said you'd have to record 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even consider one of yours. 59 to 1. That isn't a collaboration. That's a hierarchy. By January 1969, the slow-burning resentment was ready to blow. The setting was Twickenham Film Studios, a cold, sterile barn completely unlike the cozy Abbey Road. The idea, pushed by Paul, was to get back to their roots by rehearsing new songs for a TV special, all while being filmed. It was a recipe for disaster. The constant cameras made the already frayed tensions even worse. Paul, trying to steer the ship, became an overbearing musical director. John, meanwhile, had mostly checked out, his focus entirely on Yoko Ono. This left George in a horribly familiar position, being bossed around by Paul while John wasn't engaged. The inevitable explosion was caught on film in the Let It Be documentary. During a rehearsal for Two Ovis, Paul started lecturing George on how to play his part. With a nagging tone, he nitpicked George's playing. George, his face a mask of fury, finally snapped. The politeness in his voice was dripping with sarcastic resentment. "Okay, well, I don't mind," he said. "I'll play, whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was the sound of a man who had finally had enough. 4 days later, on January 10th, the final straw came. George calmly packed up his guitar, looked at his bandmates, and announced, "I'm leaving the band now. See you around the clubs." And he walked out. The reaction was shockingly cold. No one ran after him. Instead, the tapes that were secretly recording everything caught John Lennon in a moment of pure callousness, immediately suggesting a replacement. "Let's get in Eric Clapton," he said. "He's just as good and not such a headache." They then plugged Yoko into George's amp and launched into a chaotic, screeching jam session. For 5 days, George Harrison was out of the Beatles. He went home and wrote a new song that perfectly captured his feelings of being overwhelmed by the negativity. Wah wah. It was a direct shot at the headache he was getting from Paul's meddling and John's indifference. Eventually, the others realized they couldn't go on without him, and a meeting was called. But this time, George came back with conditions. He would only return if they scrapped the TV show and moved recording sessions to their own, more intimate Apple studios. They agreed. George had won the battle, but the war had taken its toll. He had to quit the biggest band in the world just to be heard. When the Beatles finally imploded for good in 1970, it was, for George, a moment of profound relief. He had years of stockpiled songs, brilliant compositions ignored by the Lennon-McCartney machine. Now, the floodgates opened. In November 1970, he released All Things Must Pass, a sprawling triple album that was a massive statement of independence. It was a creative dam bursting. The album was a huge critical and commercial success, outselling the initial solo releases from both John and Paul. The cover art said it all, a photo of George in his garden, surrounded by 4 garden gnomes, widely seen as his former bandmates, now just small figures in his grand new world. This freedom allowed George to finally speak his mind, and his most pointed criticisms were often aimed at Paul McCartney. The years of frustration came pouring out. He explained how Paul's behavior had damaged him, not just emotionally, but musically. He confessed that after so many years with Paul, his confidence as a guitarist was shattered, feeling that McCartney's overpowering nature had effectively ruined him in that role. For George, Paul's need for control, his tendency to map out every single note, was creatively suffocating. It wasn't collaboration, it was dictation. It had chipped away at George's confidence in his own musical instincts for a decade. The grudge was clear throughout the 70s. When John Lennon released his scathing anti-Paul song, How Do You Sleep?, George was right there in the studio, adding his signature slide guitar. His participation was a clear signal. He was eagerly joining in on the attack. Years later, his commentary on Paul remained sharp. He famously expressed the sentiment that he'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but he couldn't join one with Paul McCartney, calling it nothing personal, just a musical point of view. It was a classic Harrison line, a devastating critique wrapped in polite detachment. He even took a swipe at Paul's 1984 film Give My Regards to Broad Street, suggesting Paul must have re-recorded old Beatles hits because he'd run out of good new songs. For George, the breakup wasn't just the end of a band, it was an escape. However, to paint this as a story of pure hatred would be to ignore the deep, complicated bond they shared. A feud that lasts that long is never simple. Beneath the resentment and jealousy was a shared history, and in its own way, a kind of brotherly love. Their relationship was never easy, yet as the years passed, a quiet thaw began. They worked together again on the Anthology project in the mid-1990s, finishing 2 of John's old demos. But the true measure of their relationship came at the very end. As George was losing his battle with cancer in 2001, Paul made a final visit. There were no cameras, no microphones, no band politics. It was just 2 old friends who had shared an experience no one else on earth could ever understand. According to Paul's own recollection, they sat together for hours, just holding hands. All the bitterness, all the arguments over guitar solos and song credits simply faded away. In that final meeting, they weren't the Beatles. They were just Paul and George from Liverpool, the older brother and the baby brother he'd known since he was a boy on a bus. The conflict that had defined so much of their lives was finally put to rest, replaced by a quiet moment of peace and affection. It was a poignant end to one of rock and roll's most complex feuds, a final acknowledgement of the love that had always been there, however deeply it was buried. When we look back at the Beatles' story, it's easy to get lost in the spectacular fireworks of the Lennon-McCartney rivalry. It was the stuff of legend. But the more profound, and perhaps more tragic, conflict was the one that simmered in its shadow. The relationship between George Harrison and Paul McCartney wasn't a war of equals. It was a decade-long struggle against a power dynamic set in stone before they were even famous. It was the story of a genius fighting for air in a room dominated by 2 others, and the deep frustration of being patronized by the man who should have been his biggest champion. George's ultimate triumph with All Things Must Pass is one of music's greatest moments of vindication, proof of the incredible talent that had been overlooked. The fight between John and Paul may have been what broke the band apart, but the long, simmering, and deeply personal feud between George and Paul is what truly reveals the complex and often painful human heart of the Beatles' story. But that's our take. What's yours? Was George's frustration justified, or was Paul just doing what a leader has to do? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And for more stories from music history, make sure to subscribe.